Hi, folks. I hope you're not sweltering in the heat. Each week I try to think of something to talk about, and then events happen, and then I change my mind. But today I will start with the Middle East and then talk about the topic in which is has to do with migration and people in the world. Not about the virus, but the effects of the virus on millions of people who traipse around the world as migrants. It's an interesting and important issue because it's not just a human issue, but it's also an economic issue. So let's start with the Middle East. All right, so the United Arab Emirates have recognized Israel, formal diplomatic relations. Um, the formal part needs to be stressed because, as you've probably heard on the news, these countries and Israel have had relations and serious relations of military, hardware, and economic and political for some time. So this just certifies it as being open and public and diplomatic. And the argument has been made that the reason for doing this is to stop Israel from taking over the West Bank, which Netanyahu had said he would do, and defer what Israel is going to do about the West Bank. So it looks like a victory for those who are in favor of a two-state solution, because if Israel goes into the West Bank and takes it over, it really is the end of a two-state solution, and it really means a single state, and as many commentators have pointed out, an apartheid state in Israel. Now, why has Netanyahu backed off his promise to take over the West Bank and get this particular agreement? Well, there are a number of reasons, international political reasons for doing so, but he needs a victory of some sort to stay in the political game. And therefore, diplomatic relations with a bunch of Arab countries is an okay trade-off for the time being, because the West Bank situation is simply being deferred. Now, many Arab countries have relations with Israel in science, technology, arms, and so forth. The only formally recognized diplomatic relations up until now have been Jordan and Egypt, but now it's spread to the United Arab Emirates, and there is a general feeling that some other Arab countries may join. The timing is partly to help Netanyahu and Israel, but is also timing for the American presidency and Donald Trump, because as you might have noticed, it was Trump who announced this agreement, not Netanyahu in the first instance. And so he and his son-in-law can claim a great victory in the Middle East. What, of course, is lost in all of this is, what about the Palestinians, who essentially have been sold down the river? And that is a very complicated issue, not just in Israel, where there are many people who believed in the two-state solution and not just let's take over the West Bank and have a unitary apartheid state. So in part, this helps him with Israeli politics. It's also the case that the Palestinians are not very popular in the Middle East for a variety of historical and contemporary reasons. They always seem to be making trouble and seem to be troublesome. But underlying all of this is, of course, the Sunni Shiite split and trying to rein in Iran in some fashion. And Iran is in, incredibly bad shape. The U.S. sanctions and U.S. attempts to bar Iran from all kinds of things have been fairly successful. And you might or might not have noticed that the Trump administration went to the Security Council a week ago and asked that the sanctions, which were coming to an end, would be extended and made even worse. And the Security Council was unwilling to go along with it, which is another sort of nail in the coffin of how little influence the US has nowadays in international institutions and the world in general. So that's just a sort of very quick and dirty summary of that. I don't think in the next few weeks anything seriously will happen. There is, of course, the disaster in Lebanon, and that too is linked to in various ways. And then there is Saudi Arabia, which has not normalized relations yet, and probably will not straight away. But Saudi Arabia is in different kinds of difficulty, namely very little support for its war in Yemen, on the one hand, and on the other hand, its economic issues, which have to do with the reduction of global oil requirements. Because the economies in almost all countries have slowed down, therefore people are using less oil, therefore the price has dropped. So Saudi Arabia, I think, will tread water for the moment, but we will get back to the Middle East in some subsequent talk. What I wanted to talk about today was the fallout from the virus internationally. As you may or may not know, there are millions of people, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 260 to 200 million migrants. Now, what in the world? Now, what's a migrant? The vocabulary and all these things have become fuzzy. An immigrant, in a technical sense, is anybody who comes from somewhere else, but in modern parlance, very often it refers to people who legally enter the country through quotas and of one kind or another. Then there is migrant labor. Migrant labor and migrant people are, generally speaking, temporary. For example, in the United States, we have a lot of temporary migrant farm labor that picks our fruits and vegetables in California and Florida and so on. These are temporary. For some countries, these temporary workers have to have permits. And in other countries, and have to be legal. In some countries, you have a mixture of legal and illegal migrant workers of one kind or another. Now, migrant workers are not recognized as refugees unless they ask for your refuge. And refugees are people who lay claim by international law to be at risk for their lives if they're not given shelter in another country. And as you know from previous talks, people who are refugees ask for asylum. And according to international law, countries have to examine their claims to be at life's risk and can't just return them. Now, our situation in the United States has become very messy because we're unwilling to accept asylum seekers nowadays to come to the United States by and large, and we're making them wait in Mexico or at the border or in detention centers, and that's a huge mess, and it's actually counter to international law. So the US is on a very slippery slope according to its international legal obligations to honor questions of asylum seeking. Now, asylum seekers, by and large, can only seek asylum for political reasons, namely their lives are at risk. And that's a very debated subject because many people's lives are at risk for economic reasons. And should that also allow you to claim asylum? Unfortunately, there's no international law on that, no treaties on that, which require a country to admit people because they're saying, well, our farms don't work anymore. We don't have enough to eat at all. So you have immigrants, you have refugees, but you also have migrants. And the migrant population in the world is huge, and it plays a very important part in the economies of many countries. For example, many of the United Arab Emirates and other Arab countries, small Gulf Coast countries, have actually very few indigenous people. The indigenous population in some of these countries is only about 10 or 20%. Everybody else are foreigners of one kind or another. Well, some of them are, foreign businessmen and so forth. But by and large, these are migratory laborers. The population of the Sudan, for example, 30% of the population of Sudan are foreign workers, many of them migratory laborers. Some of them are, oil executives, and diplomats and so on. But lots of them are migratory laborers. Now, when the pandemic hit and the economic downturn hit in the Middle East, as well as in other parts of the world, what you have were a reduced need for these migrant workers. These migrant workers, sometimes women who are sort of 30% of migrant workers, at least in the Gulf states. Let me just say that the Gulf states per se have about 3.5 million migratory laborers, of which about 31% are women. So you have a huge percentage of the population who work as maids, who work in service capacities, who work in construction, and on and on. Well, all of a sudden, these countries don't need those people, don't want those people, or can't afford those people. For example, in the household, you may now not be able to afford as many servants as you used to have. So these countries would like their migrant laborers to go home. Well, where are they from? They're from India, they're from Bangladesh, they're from the Philippines, they're from lots of places. And they can't just return because many of the countries, because of the virus, don't want them to return or don't allow them to return. And in addition to that, many of them don't have the funds with which to return because they've been unemployed now for several months. So you have a huge population in the Middle East, and huge population worldwide, which is adrift in a sense, getting impoverished, the government's not taking any particular responsibility, and the reason for them being there has vanished. Now, there's a flip side to that, which is really quite interesting. One of the important aspects of why migrant workers are important, not just to the economies that have them, but they're really important to the economies of the countries that they come from. And because they send a large chunk of their income in remittances back to wherever they came from. That, by the way, is also true of migratory labor in the United States, right? Many towns in Mexico are essentially supported from remittances, not just from migratory laborers, but also Mexican immigrants. So the labor from countries that work overseas are really a very important aspect of the economies of countries. So, for example, I just have to look at the figures. Let me give you another non-Middle East figures. Hong Kong, which has also been in the news, has about 7.5 million people who are in Hong Kong, from Hong Kong and mainland China, of which about almost 3 million people are migratory laborers. They're maids, they work in restaurants, they do all kinds of things. And the economy in Hong Kong requires these people to be operational. Okay, now you have a decline in the economy of Hong Kong, right? And so these people aren't wanted anymore. Many of them are still stuck in Hong Kong. But where are they from? In Hong Kong, most of them happen to be, or many of them happen to be, from the Philippines. The Philippines economy is dependent on the remittances of these people. So, for example, the Philippines has a population of a little over 9 million people, of which maybe somewhere like 2 million, 3 or 4 are working overseas and sending remittances to the Philippines. So there's a chain reaction here. The economies in the Middle East are stressed or in decline. They are we're heavily dependent on migratory laborers. They now don't need many of those migratory laborers. They want to send them home. Some can't go home, but even the ones that can go home don't have employment at home. And meantime, the economies of the countries from which they originally came are suffering serious economic reverses because their budgets were dependent on the remittances, not the budgets of the government, but the sustaining of the families in those countries. And now the governments are asked to do something for their population, which are newly impoverished because they were dependent on remittances. Can you see the instability of all of this? You have the virus, you have an economic downturn, you have some parts of the world very dependent on migratory labor, temporary labor. And those laborers, because of the virus, because of the economic downturn, are now not needed or not needed in large numbers. They either should be sent home, in which case, if they go home, they're unemployed and they add to the unemployment roll, or even if they stay put or are allowed to stay put for the time being, their remittances are not flowing into the economies of those countries. It is a total mess and nightmare out there in just the human dimensions of something which, from the perspective of the US, is not really, highlighted, because all we're dealing with is, by and large, migratory labor from Latin America. And those migratory laborers sometimes are still here, and then similar problems exist in terms of them not able to go home or not really wanted anymore in the US. But basically, we still need our migratory laborers, unlike some of the countries in the Middle East, because our migratory laborers is essentially farm labor, and we need the farm labor. Now you say, well, this may all be a kind of a third world, issue, but it's not entirely. And let me give you an odd, different kind of example. England, whose economy is in a serious downturn, nevertheless has a large agricultural sector. And the agricultural sector requires labor for picking the vegetables and the fruit, right? Those laborers in England have largely come from East Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, and so forth. Okay. Those folks are not being allowed in right now into England because of the virus, which means the vegetables and the fruits aren't being picked. So what has the government of England done, or United Kingdom done? What they've essentially said is that English people should be picking these fruits and vegetables. Okay, they've made it possible for students and English unemployed folks to go pick fruits and vegetables, but now it turns out that they're not experienced farm pickers, and so they pick very slowly, and therefore the whole industry is not as productive and is losing money. So even a European industrial country has the virus bounce around to not being, for different reasons, not having migratory laborers. The migratory laborers which is needed in the farm sector isn't accessible. They try to use domestic folks, right? And that doesn't work out because they're not experienced laborers. It reminds me of the sort of racist policies, or at least statements, of some years ago when Trump administration and racists in general were saying, who needs all these Mexicans and Central Americans to work on the farms? There are all these unemployed youths in Chicago. Well, the unemployed youth in Chicago are not going to come to the Central Valley to pick fruits and vegetables. And even if you required them to come through some authorization, which we've never done, they would pick them very slowly and ineffectively because they're not skilled. They're urban kids. They're not skilled in these matters. So this talk this morning is kind of messy because I'm bopping around. But what I really want to do is to show that what we are fixed on is our own virus. the fact that we have the highest outbreak and the highest death toll anywhere in the world, and we're an industrial country, and the disaster of our domestic policies. But there is a world out there, and there are economies out there, and that world has been dependent on, in a sense, the globalization of labor. And that globalization has been radically hampered or reduced, depending on which country you look at. A, because people can't move around as easily. They can't either leave, or they can't enter a country, or they're stuck in a country. But it even doesn't address the fact that so many third world countries, particularly, as I said, the Philippines, in many ways, Indonesia, Bangladesh, all kinds of countries are dependent economically, or the people in their countries are dependent economically on the millions and billions of dollars of remittances that these laborers send to support their wives and children and other families back home. So there are disastrous situations out there, which are spin-offs of what has been caused by the virus. And from the perspective of the U.S., it's of course, also in our backyard in terms of not allowing people in. You might have read the news this morning in the New York Times and elsewhere that we are still, getting criticized for these camps that we set up. So now we're capturing people who should be processed quickly for asylum claims. We're now sending to all kinds of motels that are privately supervised. And so we are dispersing people so that you and I don't really see the magnitudes of what's happening to family and children, along the border. It's also the case that for years now, there was relatively little migration from Mexico to the United States. There was a lot of migratory labor, but not attempts to immigrate into the United States. Immigration and asylum seekers came mainly from Central America. And that has recently changed somewhat in the last few months, because the economic situation and the virus situation is so bad in Mexico that now there are Mexicans who are trying to also come over the border legally and illegally and join family members and use their, in some cases, their dual citizenship to return to the United States, because they're finding themselves in economic distress, which they were not in, or not as seriously in, a few years from now. So actually, while I emphasize the Middle East which is where the evidence of what has happened to migratory labor is particularly stark, because it's such a large population in so many Middle East countries. The fact of the matter is that the globalization of the movement around labor is hitting the United States again in different ways, in an administration and a regime which, number one, does not adhere to the norms of the international treaties having to do with refugees, and is not adhering to the human rights norms that we are actually obliged to adhere to. I just want to say one more word, which is that we are not talking about a few 100,000 people. We are talking millions of people, right, who are not living in their own countries. And one of the things, because time is up, I haven't even hit, is that, for example, almost the entire cruise industry, and some of you might have direct contract by taking cruises, is populated by people from the Philippines, from Indonesia, and so forth. These people, some of them are adrift in the oceans, and others have been able to land somewhere and return to home. And so there is, aside from farm laborers and from service personnel, and in Saudi Arabia, oil workers and construction workers, there is also a rather sizable international population of people who work on ships and who work there for years, often not seeing their families very often back home, because they need the remittances to make it possible for their wives and children to survive back home, to get an education, and so on. So while we're sort of talking about, oh, globalization has become, decoupled nationalism, let's close borders, the reality is that many countries really can only temporarily close borders, because if and when the economy in the Middle East picks up in amongst the Arab states, for example, many of them, they will need the labor again. So the movement of people, I would argue, will continue, but the stress that the people who move around are currently facing is a huge problem. And the World Food Program, which is a UN agency, is trying to help feed people. And we're not even talking about, or today at least, I didn't even talk about refugees, people trying to leave their countries permanently because their life is unviable. And thus, refugee ships, by the way, are increasing again off the coast of Turkey and Greece. And smartly, those countries now intercept those boats before they get into their territorial sea, which makes it illegal to send people away. So they're out in the open ocean, and it's left to a non-governmental organization to either rescue them or allow them to drown. So even the refugee situation has not really diminished, but that's not really what my thrust of my talk today was. It really had to do with migratory populations and labor, which has been badly affected as the economies of the world have been affected. So next time, I think, unless something disastrous happens, I will try to address some issues having to do with how the virus, the economic impact, and so forth, has impacted consideration, national consideration, and private company considerations having to do with climate change and the environment. Speaking of climate change, it's very hot. We are the beneficiaries already of global warming. So I hope you stay cool, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.